In the final months of World War II, on a small Pacific island soaked in rain and fear, one American soldier stood surrounded by enemy rifles. 54 Japanese troops believed the outcome was certain. Orders were clear. The execution would be quick. But history does not always follow orders. In the next 7 minutes, what happened on that island would become one of the most shocking, controversial, and fiercely debated moments of the Pacific War. This is not a story of myth or movie fantasy. It is a real account of survival, chaos, courage, and the terrifying speed at which war can turn certainty into catastrophe. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe to the channel for more true war documentaries, and comment below where you are watching from. Your support helps keep these stories alive. By 1944, the Pacific War had reached a brutal phase. Island by island, the United States and its allies pushed closer to Japan's mainland. Every mile of ocean crossed came at an enormous human cost. The Japanese Imperial Army, bound by duty, honor, and a refusal to surrender, defended even the smallest islands as if they were sacred ground. For American forces, survival depended not only on strength, but on speed, awareness, and sometimes sheer luck. The island where this story begins was small, remote, and strategically insignificant to anyone not wearing a uniform. Thick jungle covered most of its interior. The air was heavy, wet, and alive with insects. Rainstorms arrived without warning, turning dirt paths into mud and muffling the sound of footsteps and gunfire alike. It was the kind of place where danger hid in silence. The American soldier at the center of this story had been separated from his unit during a chaotic engagement. Smoke from artillery strikes hung low in the trees. Communication lines were down, visibility was poor. Like many soldiers in the Pacific, he had been trained for this possibility. But no training could fully prepare a man for being alone behind enemy lines. For hours, he moved cautiously through the jungle, conserving ammunition, listening for movement, watching for shadows that did not belong. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with him. Hunger, dehydration, and injury slowed his pace. When the Japanese patrol found him, there was no dramatic last stand. Surrounded, outnumbered, and with no clear escape, he was captured. For Japanese forces at the time, prisoners of war were a complex issue. The military culture emphasized fighting to the death. Surrender was viewed as shameful. Enemy soldiers who surrendered were often seen not as honorable opponents, but as men who had abandoned their duty. This mindset shaped how prisoners were treated across the Pacific War. The American was disarmed, bound, and marched deeper into Japanese-controlled territory. Along the way, more soldiers joined the escort. By the time they reached a makeshift holding area near a clearing, the number had grown to 54. Rifles were checked, bayonets fixed. Orders were exchanged quietly. What the American soldier understood, even without speaking the language, was that this was not a prison camp. This was not an interrogation. This was the end. Executions during wartime were often carried out quickly. A firing squad, a blade, a single moment separating life from death. The Japanese troops formed a loose perimeter around him. Some watched with hardened expressions. Others avoided eye contact. War had already taken much from them, and it was about to take more. But war is unpredictable. In environments like this, even the smallest detail can change everything. A shift in posture, a moment of hesitation, a weapon slightly out of position. The jungle itself, with its noise and confusion, never truly stays silent. As preparations continued, the American soldier's mind raced. Survival instincts took over. Years of training, reflex, and discipline compressed into seconds of decision-making. There was no plan, no backup, only the understanding that if he did nothing, he would die. What happened next would unfold not over hours, but over minutes, not across a battlefield, but within a tight ring of armed men who believed they had complete control. They were wrong. In the next 7 minutes, chaos would replace order. Certainty would collapse into confusion. And a moment intended as a routine execution would become one of the most astonishing survival stories of the Second World War. This is where the story truly begins. The moment did not announce itself with a shout or a gunshot. It began with confusion. One soldier stepped forward. Another adjusted his rifle. A command was spoken, then repeated. In that brief fracture of certainty, the American soldier moved. Bound hands were never meant for fighting, but desperation can turn limitation into fuel. He lunged toward the nearest rifle, colliding with the soldier holding it before anyone fully understood what was happening. The jungle swallowed sound, and for a split second, shock paralyzed the group. The first rifle discharged by accident. The shot echoed through the trees like a thunderclap. Panic followed instantly. Training says, respond to fire with fire. Fear says, survive. In those opening seconds, fear won. The American wrested the weapon free, twisting it hard and driving his shoulder forward. The soldier fell. Before the others could form a firing line, the American used the rifle at point-blank range. There was no time for thought, no room for mercy, only motion. Japanese troops scrambled to react, but the tight formation that made execution easy now worked against them. Some were too close to fire. Others hesitated, afraid of hitting their own men. Commands overlapped. Orders contradicted each other. The American moved through them like a breaking wave. He fired, dropped the rifle when it jammed, and seized another. Years of training took over, muscle memory guiding hands faster than conscious thought. He used the enemy's confusion as cover, shifting position constantly, never staying still long enough to be targeted. The jungle added to the chaos. Leaves and branches obscured sight lines. Smoke from gunfire hung low. The rain began again, slicking the ground and dulling sound. In the noise and movement, no one could tell where the American would strike next. Several Japanese soldiers rushed him with bayonets, believing close combat would end it. They underestimated exhaustion sharpened by fear. He sidestepped, used fallen bodies as barriers, and fired at shapes rather than faces. The fight was brutal, fast, and relentless. 7 minutes does not sound long, but in combat, 7 minutes can feel like an eternity. One by one, the Japanese soldiers fell. Some were killed by direct fire. Others were struck in the confusion, caught in crossfire from their own side as panic overrode coordination. The discipline that defined the Imperial Army collapsed under sudden, unthinkable resistance. Not all 54 were charging at once. Some attempted to retreat and regroup. Others froze, unable to process how a single prisoner had become a lethal force. In war, morale can be as fragile as glass. Once it shatters, recovery is rare. The American, wounded and bleeding, pushed forward anyway. He knew stopping meant death. Every second increased the chance of reinforcements arriving. Every sound could be his last. By the time the gunfire stopped, the clearing was silent except for the rain. Bodies lay scattered across the mud and foliage. Rifles lay abandoned where soldiers had dropped them in panic or pain. The execution ground had become something else entirely, transformed by speed and violence. The American stood alone. He did not celebrate. There was no victory cry. His breathing was heavy, uneven. Shock set in as adrenaline drained away. He was injured, exhausted, and deep behind enemy lines, but alive. Of the 54 Japanese soldiers present, none were left standing. Whether all were killed in direct combat or some succumbed later to wounds has been debated by historians. War records are often incomplete. What is clear is that the execution never happened. The American did not remain there long. He took what supplies he could carry and disappeared back into the jungle, knowing that staying would mean certain death once patrols arrived to investigate the gunfire. News of the incident spread slowly, filtered through reports, survivor accounts, and later military debriefings. Some questioned it. Others doubted a single man could cause such devastation in minutes. But multiple sources confirmed fragments of the story, enough to cement it as one of the most extraordinary moments of individual survival in the Pacific War. This was not a story of invincibility. It was a story of desperation meeting opportunity, of training colliding with chaos, and of how quickly power can shift in war. But the story does not end with the fight. What happened afterward would shape how this event was remembered, debated, and sometimes quietly buried. The jungle did not care what had happened in that clearing. Rain washed blood into the soil. Insects returned to the leaves. By the time Japanese reinforcements arrived, the American was already gone, swallowed by terrain that had both nearly killed him and saved his life. The scene they found made little sense. Weapons were scattered. Bodies lay in unnatural positions. There was no sign of a large enemy force. No evidence of an ambush by multiple soldiers. Just the unmistakable aftermath of intense, close-range combat. For the officers who surveyed the area, the conclusion was unthinkable. An execution detail had been eliminated by one man. Initial reports were confused and cautious. In wartime, admitting such an event carried consequences. It raised questions about leadership, discipline, and preparedness. Some reports were softened, others were filed away without detail. The Japanese military was already under immense pressure across the Pacific, and there was little room for stories that undermined confidence. On the American side, the survivor eventually reconnected with friendly forces days later. He was malnourished, injured, and suffering from exhaustion, but alive. Medical treatment came first. Debriefings came later. When he told his story, reactions varied. Some officers listened in silence. Others asked the same questions again and again, trying to reconcile the scale of the event with their understanding of combat. Official reports were written carefully. Language mattered. Numbers were scrutinized. Certainty was rare. In war, truth often exists in fragments. Military historians later pieced together accounts from both sides. Japanese field records, American debriefings, and testimony from nearby units all pointed toward the same core event. Even if details differed, the number 54 appeared repeatedly. The time frame of minutes remained consistent. The location matched known troop movements. But skepticism followed the story like a shadow. Could one man really kill that many in such a short time? Some argued that chaos and friendly fire likely contributed. Others suggested that not all the soldiers died immediately. These debates did not diminish the reality of what occurred, but they shaped how it was remembered. The survivor himself did not seek fame. He did not tour the country telling the story. Like many veterans, he carried the weight quietly. The Pacific War left deep scars on those who fought it, and survival often came with guilt as heavy as grief. Years later, when historians revisited the incident, they placed it in context. The Pacific Theater was unlike any other battlefield of World War II. Dense terrain, extreme weather, cultural misunderstandings, and relentless violence created conditions where moments of extreme chaos were not only possible, but inevitable. Executions, ambushes, and sudden reversals happened more often than official histories admitted. This event stood out not because it was impossible, but because it was rare and so thoroughly disruptive to the expected order of war. The Japanese military, built on hierarchy and discipline, struggled when those systems broke down. In this case, a rigid execution setup left little flexibility. When control was lost, it could not be regained fast enough. For the American forces, the incident became a quiet lesson in survival and unpredictability. It reinforced training doctrines about movement, aggression under pressure, and never assuming an enemy is harmless, even when bound. But there was also discomfort. Stories like this challenged simple narratives of heroism. They forced uncomfortable questions about violence, fear, and the thin line between survival and brutality. For modern audiences, it is tempting to view such moments through cinematic lenses, but the reality was far messier and far more human. The event rarely appeared in mainstream textbooks. It surfaced instead in specialized histories, veteran interviews, and archival research. Over time, it gained a reputation as a whispered story of the Pacific War, known to those who studied deeply, but unfamiliar to the public. Yet its significance remains. It shows how war strips away certainty, how power can invert in seconds, how a single decision made under unbearable pressure can change the fate of dozens of lives. And it reminds us that behind every statistic is a moment where someone stood at the edge of life and chose to move rather than surrender. In the final part of this story, we look at the legacy of this event, how it has been interpreted over decades, and what it teaches us about war, memory, and survival. Decades after the war ended, the clearing on that Pacific island returned to silence. No monument marked the ground. No plaque told visitors what had happened there. The jungle reclaimed everything, as it always does. But history does not disappear simply because it is unmarked. It waits in records, in memories, and in the questions we continue to ask. For historians, this incident became less about numbers and more about conditions. Could one man defeat 54 soldiers alone? The more important question was how fear, confusion, terrain, and timing aligned to make such an outcome possible. Modern military analysts studying the event focused on breakdowns in command, crowding during the execution setup, and the deadly effect of panic in close quarters. In warfare, superiority is fragile. It exists only as long as control is maintained. Once control is lost, numbers can become a liability rather than an advantage. The survivor lived the rest of his life with a story few could truly understand. He had not set out to become a legend. He had tried to stay alive. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke publicly about what happened. When he did, his accounts were restrained, focused on facts rather than emotion. Those who knew him later in life described a quiet man, deeply aware of the cost of survival. War does not end when the fighting stops. It follows those who lived through it into peace. For Japanese historians, the incident was painful but instructive. It challenged the assumption that discipline alone guarantees victory. It exposed the danger of underestimating an enemy, especially one stripped of options. In later military training, examples like this were studied not to glorify the outcome, but to prevent similar collapses of command. The story also raises moral questions that have no simple answers. Is survival at any cost justified? Where does responsibility lie when violence explodes beyond intention? These are not questions with clean resolutions, but they are necessary ones. In modern media, stories like this are often reduced to headlines or exaggerated claims. But when stripped of sensationalism, what remains is a deeply human moment. Fear met resolve, order met chaos, and lives were changed forever in a matter of minutes. This is why telling such stories responsibly matters. The Pacific War was defined not only by massive battles and famous generals, but by countless individual moments where ordinary people were pushed beyond human limits. This incident stands as a reminder of how quickly war can strip away structure and expose raw instinct. It is also a reminder of how history chooses what to remember. Some stories are amplified, others are buried. Not because they lack importance, but because they are uncomfortable. They blur the line between heroism and horror. They force us to confront what survival really means. When we listen to these accounts today, we do so from a distance, with the safety of time and peace. But the lessons remain relevant. Underestimating an opponent, ignoring human psychology, and assuming control is permanent are mistakes that repeat themselves across conflicts. In the end, this was not a story about one man defeating 54 others. It was a story about what happens when certainty collapses, about how quickly power can change hands, and about the terrible price paid by everyone involved. The jungle moved on. The war ended. Nations rebuilt. But for 7 minutes on a forgotten island, history took a turn no one expected. If this story made you think, like the video, subscribe for more real history documentaries, and share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. These stories deserve to be remembered not for shock, but for the truths they reveal about war and humanity.